Well, hello and welcome to another day of Bible study. So glad that you are here with us as we are working through the book of Ephesians. Today we find ourselves in chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. And this is the third part of a three-part mini section of household codes within the book of Ephesians. And so I'm excited to get to this one today. But first, you can join us on this Bible study journey, and I would encourage you to do so. There's not much time left in it, but that's absolutely okay. You can still be a part. And to download the reading schedule, just head on over to go.christtable.today/unity. And right there, you will find a PDF that lists out the entire reading schedule. You can go back and watch all the old Bible studies, or just start right where you are here today and then go with us from here forward. And I want to encourage you to check out Christ Table. We are a ministry that is doing things differently, and that is doing things as much as is possible, as close to the way the early church did ministry. Now, obviously, we rely on technology a lot, but our primary mission is to equip you and to equip others to be spiritual leaders, yourselves in your own homes, around your own tables. And if that sounds a little bit scary, don't let it be scary. It's real easy to do. And just, head over to christtable.today. Sign up for our email list there. You'll find out more about what's going on here at Christ Table. And specifically, I'd love to encourage you to consider making us a part of your regular generosity plan. Now, in return, what we do is we provide you resources regularly for free for those who regularly donate to this ministry. Now, that's a really important thing, because if you're going to be self-leading and self-feeding in some way and learning and growing and becoming more spiritually whole, you're going to need to know how to do that. And so what we do is every couple of months, we send a box that is absolutely jam-packed with spiritual resources, with books, with gifts, with Bible studies, with ways to live out your faith. And then we work through all of those materials together. Now, all you need to do is just become a regular donor of Christ Table. And right at the very beginning of October or end of September, if you're a regular donor, if you've made a donation at christtable.today, then one of these will show up in your mailbox as our gift to you. And I'll tell you, if you go ahead and set up that regular giving right now, I'll actually send you the last box as well. I have a few sitting around here, and so you actually get two boxes within the space of just a few weeks. And no commitment to us. We're just here to provide spiritual resources to you for free, just like this Bible study. And so we're glad to have you a part. But would you consider, please, being a part? None of this happens for free. And so this is the way that we fund and make sure that we're able to continue to provide this for you. So why don't we dig in? When we come to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 6 through 9, we are in the third part of a three-part series where Paul is essentially giving good practical advice for households. We started with practical advice for marriage relationships, specifically marriage relationships between a man and a woman, because of the role of women in society in the first century was very different than the role of women today. And Christianity comes along and provides a radically different view of the role and the rights and the value of women. And so Paul has to kind of get into that and say, in a marriage relationship, here is how that might need to be lived out. Then in the second part, we talked about children and how children and parents should interact with each other. In much the same way as women, children had really no rights in a family. And the way they viewed children in those days was very different than the way we view children in these days. Christianity comes along and very much upsets the social order. It gives value and freedom to children and also encourages parents to take a personal responsibility very early on for their children. And so Paul has to kind of walk through and explain again how Christianity is different in that relationship, just as he did with the relationship between men and women in a marriage setting. And so today we come to the third household code conversation that Paul's going to have. And this one is between slaves and masters. Now, the first thing that we need to understand, as we've tried to explain over the last few days, is that the cultural setting and situation in the first century is very different than it is today. And so we have to resist the urge to place our ideas of what marriage is and looks like on top of the first century. Same thing with parents and children. We have to resist the urge to place what happens today in family relationships on top of that, or else we're going to misunderstand what Paul is trying to say to marriages and to families. Same thing when we come to today's verses in chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, about masters and slaves. When we hear the word slave, typically, especially if you're watching this in U.S. America, we think of the racial slavery that happened in the last few hundred years. We think of slave ships coming here from Africa. We see slavery as a race-directed situation, and those things are true for America, but they were not true in the first century, at least not in the context that Paul is writing to. There, slavery was not based on ethnicity. Any ethnicity could be a slave, and people could fall into slavery by any means, honestly. It could be by birth. They were born into a slave family. It could be that they were sold into slavery. It could be that they simply ran out of money and had no way to support themselves or couldn't support themselves, and so they put themselves into slavery. It could be that they had done something in society, something illegal that caused them to end up in slavery. And there were multiple other ways in which people could end up in slavery. And also it looked different than slavery in U.S. America did, in that it was not necessarily a lifetime commitment. There were freedoms and legal positives that were afforded to slaves that were not afforded to slaves here in the U.S., though sometimes slavery looked very the same then as it did now, but not always. The other thing that we know as well is that slaves could buy their own freedom back in those situations. Didn't always happen. The last thing that I want to say before I jump into the verses is that slavery was pervasive during the first century. In Greek and Roman contexts, as many or more than a third of the entire population was slaves. And so most households had slaves in those days. And with that in mind, why don't we jump into Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, where Paul begins by writing directly to slaves. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Now, what we might want Paul to say is slavery is wrong, slavery is evil, slavery is not okay, revolt. Paul doesn't say that, and that causes some concern. But the first thing that we have to understand is that, especially in the first century, the Christians' desire was not to upset the social order or culture. Christians' desire were simply to understand the gospel, understand Jesus Christ, and understand how, no matter who you were, no matter how you were, no matter where you were, how you could, under the circumstances in which you found yourself, grow and follow Jesus Christ. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity was not subversive. Christianity was highly subversive, but rather than being out front and public lots of times, it was behind the scenes, teaching people a better way of living. We see that even in this verse where Paul, writing to slaves, says, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. And so the first thing that we see here is that Paul is encouraging slaves to do well at their role, to be well thought of, to be deeply respectful, which is likely something that many slaves were not. And so Paul is saying, you're modeling Jesus Christ in your faith. So if you can't in the moment change the circumstances that you're in, you can change you. You may not be able to change the situation, but you can change you. And by changing how you respond to the situation, you may actually end up changing the situation. Serve them sincerely as you serve Christ. We don't immediately see this, but this is, again, a highly subversive idea. The idea that not only are you serving your master as a slave, but you are also serving Christ. Now, as a Christian, you have a greater master whom you serve. Imagine a slave owner now not being number one in a slave's life, in his or her slave's circle. Think of that. It's a radical idea, but how can they get mad? If that servant is serving them better than any of their other slaves and deeply respectful of them, it's highly subversive. What do you do about someone who now is not just a slave to you, but is also a slave to Jesus Christ, but is serving you well? What do you do with that? So what we see here is that Paul doesn't upset the cultural order, but what we have seen in verse 5 and what we'll see in 6 through 9 is a highly, extremely subversive set of ideas around and about slavery that end up actually bringing to an end for a lot of people, especially Christians who were masters and had slaves. It ends up bringing it to an end, even though Paul doesn't say, stop it. Verse 6, still speaking to the slaves, try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all of your heart. Now, this requires a bit of a broader understanding of what Paul has written in Christianity, but Paul has used this language throughout most of his letters, and not just to slaves. Paul has said to all of us, we are servants of Christ, and he's actually used that idea, slaves of Christ. In fact, oftentimes, rather than using the term master, he uses the term Lord. And so the master, slave owner is Lord, but also the Lord is Lord. And so Paul is encouraging all of us, not just those who are slaves, but everybody in the first century who is a Christian, to see themselves as a slave. So imagine you're a slave. You're a part of the 1/3 of the population, but there are 2/3 of people and many other Christians who are not in indentured servitude, who are not slaves. Now, imagine a pastor, evangelist, the leading thinker, Paul, coming and saying, you know what, you have value as a slave, but all of you who aren't slaves, you're still slaves. In this moment, what Paul has done is Paul has, you can see, either raised the level of slaves to be equal with people who are not in slavery, but now are slaves to Jesus Christ. Or you could see it as Paul is lowering those people who have their freedom to the exact same level as slaves. Paul, at one other point in Scripture, says that God doesn't see male or female, that God doesn't see Jew or Gentile, that God doesn't see slave or free. And this is what Paul is getting at here. As Christians, we are all in the same boat, and we are all slaves to Christ. Imagine how that made slaves feel. We are all slaves to Christ. Yes, I may have a master, I may be a slave to him, but I'm also in slavery to Jesus Christ. And so are you. Verse 7, work with enthusiasm. Paul is still encouraging them to do well, even if they're in a situation that isn't right, to still do right and to be right. Work with enthusiasm as though you were working for the Lord rather than for the people. Paul encourages them, you know what? Don't think of it as you're working for somebody else. Think of it as you're working for the Lord rather than for people. I love that perspective. And remember, verse 8, that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do, whether we're slaves or free. And so Paul says, you know what? You may not be seeing the payoff today for what you're doing for other people, for what you're doing for your master. But if you live well, if you live rightly, as we spoke a few days ago, if you step well in your walk through this journey, then you will be rewarded. the same as someone who is free, because God sees no difference between the two. In fact, you as a slave may be more rewarded long term than those people who are free, because you lived well and worked well and modeled well under such terrible circumstances. And then verse 9, and with this we'll close for today. And I love this because he now pauses speaking to slaves and speaks directly to the masters. Treat your slaves in the same way. Don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. What Paul does here is actually quite brilliant, because now these previous verses from 5 to 8, where he has been speaking directly to how slaves act, interact, and treat their masters, Paul now turns that on its head, upside down, and says, okay, if you're a slave owner, if you're a master and you have slaves, you need to treat your slaves in the same way. I want you to go back, Paul says, and reread what I wrote to slaves, and I want you to do that as well. Specifically, no threatening, and remember, you both have the exact same master in heaven, and your master in heaven has no favorites. This statement is difficult for us to fully see because, well, I don't know that any of us are slave owners today, that any of us are masters, at least in the classic sense of that. Also, we can't understand this through the lens of the first century. But this is an absolutely shocking statement that he's made to masters, to treat them equally and to understand that even the master is a slave as well. Taken alone, just this one verse, Ephesians 6:9, would have, if followed by masters, essentially ended slavery for Christians. He's essentially saying here, in God's eyes, everybody is equal. And in God's eyes, the way you treat people is exactly the same, and your rewards are going to be based on how you live your life. What Paul does here is effectively, without saying it, say, there's really no way for you to own another person and do so under the authority or the guidelines of what it means to be a Christian or following the Christian life. And so that's why we said in the very beginning, in fact, I'll put it right back up here, that Paul doesn't outright upset the cultural order in this verse or in the previous two household codes that we've talked about. But each one of these are extremely subversive, and each one of them do end up changing the cultural order. And this is the way Christians have always done it, or should have always done it, in that they change themselves, and that by changing themselves, they end up radically changing the cultural order around them. Husband-wife, male-female relationships in a marriage, parent-child relationships in a family, and master-slave relationships in the social order. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. It's been great to be with you. I am actually, for one, glad that we've made it through the household colds. Those are tough. I so wish I could have spent more time on them, but I'm also thankful to run back through them again because things are not always the way they seem on first read. And it's always so important for us to understand the cultural context and what the first readers would have heard and understood, and then be able to understand maybe what, if anything, we can pull out of that for ourselves. Hey, make sure to stop by christtable.today at some point. Sign up for the email list. We'd love for you to become a part, too, of being a regular donor to this ministry. And there's a lot of benefit to doing that, in that we're generous as well. Well, until next time, it's been good to have you here with us. And